Okay, shall I just go? Right. Well, I have the pleasant task of summing up. And I think it's been a tremendous day, and we've had some wonderful discussions. I thought, as we ended the last session with the Queen, I suppose we better carry on with the Queen. Someone ought to collect together all the things that the Queen has said which aren't very many, but has said over her reign. The one I really like is the one which appeared at the trial of Paul Burrell, the butler of Diana, and when he said that the Queen said to him, there are strange forces in this country, Paul, of which we know nothing. And the QC then asked him and said, what did the Queen mean by that remark? And Paul Burrell said, one doesn't ask the Queen what she means by something. so which I always think is one. So anyway, we have had contributions from almost every possible perspective, and almost everything has been covered. We haven't had anyone from the campaign for an English Parliament, but I'm afraid that I can't provide that. I thought what would be very good would be to go back to what Christian was talking about this morning, and the 6 themes which he raised for us to discuss during the day, and then just to see how well we did, and whether we did actually focus on his 6 themes. And I think we didn't do badly. So here's just a few quick thoughts about those 6 themes. The moments of Englishness was the first one. The question of whether those moments when a certain idea of England and Englishness crystallizes, and Christian asked, are we experiencing today another such moment? And I think the general view of many people who contributed to today is that something is stirring, something is happening, but there's a bit of disagreement clearly about exactly what it is and how significant it's going to turn out to be. But it's both what Mike was talking about, the new imaginative horizon of Englishness, and the multiple identities, and this cultural transformation of Englishness, which actually goes back a very long time and isn't related to necessarily to particular political events. But then there are the political events which actually are crystallizing some of these, crystallizing potentially new ideas of England and Englishness. And we talked a lot about this in the last session with devolution and the Scottish referendum and the forthcoming EU referendum. So that this does look like, in the long history of Englishness, this does look like a very distinctive moment. So then the second theme was Englishness and Britishness, and this is probably what we spent most time on during the day in trying to tease out various aspects of this. Christian asked, is Britishness in decline? Tristram Hunt said, drew our attention to the strength of Englishness before Britishness, and we also discussed a lot about the forms of political Englishness that are possible and that are emergent. Julia Stapleton quoted Roger Scruton about England at one time the English did not have to ask who they were. And this idea of Englishness being there but being rather absent and difficult to pin down precisely, that was a strong theme of the day, but also the sense that is this moment of Englishness the moment where actually some of that ambiguity, some of that imprecision has to be laid aside. And it led on to lots of debates in several of the sessions about whether a new union is needed. It was Arthur's question, whether the union is falling apart, what kind of role Englishness can play within it. So we have that very strong sense, though, that in some way Englishness is still a state of mind. That's still that idea of that Englishness is whimsical and eccentric and very inward, to do with culture, whereas the political side of Englishness is Britishness, and it's whether that is actually breaking down. And there were lots of very interesting contributions on that. I wouldn't say we had a consensus, but we certainly explored that issue a lot. Then thirdly, the theme of Englishness and Europe. We didn't really talk very much about this. I mean, it came in a bit, and it came in the last session in relation to the EU referendum. Again, the question was, is there a European basis to Englishness? And I think there is a lot more to be said here probably than we did say. I mean, because on the face of it, it is a very odd thing that Englishness does seem to be separate and apart from Europe when we have this long continuous history as a European country. And if you think about one of my favourite events, the Siege of Malta in 1564, and when the siege was lifted, England was a Protestant country under Queen Elizabeth I, but all the church bells in England were rung because of the significance of the victory for Christendom as it was seen, and that reminds us of the much greater unity that there once was, and the way in which people at one time in England would have seen themselves not as a part, but as part of a European cultural space, and yet that isn't how most English people experience Europe today, and it's in marked contrast to what we were talking about with how most English people feel towards the United States and towards American culture. And it's not that, that lots of English people do, of course, visit Europe and do live in Europe, but of course there are parts of Europe which are very English, like parts of Spain and parts of Crete and so on, and the degree to which that an English culture has been imposed is what strikes you when you visit. So that I think it's a really interesting question, though, in this if this is a significant moment of for Englishness, that as to whether there is a form of Englishness which can assume a more European character. And so the example that John used about the singing of the Marseillaise and those sorts, you wonder what those sorts of interventions, it is quite striking the degree of spontaneous solidarity there did appear to be with the French after the shootings in Paris. And I suppose what is surprising is that those events are really quite few and far between. It's much more common, things like the metric martyrs from a few years back, when the shopkeeper who was prosecuted for refusing to use metric weights and was using imperial weights, and he was found guilty, of course, in the court, but came outside to declare proudly, "I am British, I am not European," which, of course, today he'd say, "I'm English, I'm not European," but it's the same sense. The third theme, Englishness and race, I think we spent least of all time on this, and I think Simon Heffer addressed it in part by talking about non-racial, non-extreme English identity and the possibilities for that emerging. But we didn't really explore what obviously there's a huge literature on this, the complexities of the different ethnic communities in the UK and their relationship both to Britishness and to Englishness. Then empire, the fifth theme. I think we had quite a lot of discussion about empire, but not so much in terms of the Britain's colonial empire, but rather in the sense of the original meaning of empire, namely the Union, the idea of England as an empire. And I think the interesting question it raised for me is the issue of, in this moment, do the English still want to be an empire in the sense in which they have for such a long part of their history? Do they still want to project their power? And that's particularly interesting at the moment in relation to the other nations within the UK Union. And it led on, I mean, we had those interesting discussions, David Feldman and Eugene talking about what is the state for, what is England for, the issues of the institutions which and the legal arrangements which held the Union together and encouraged the practice of a particular statecraft which was very mindful of centripetal and centrifugal pressures and sought to manage the whole, making pragmatic concessions. I mean, it struck me, it was very interesting when we were talking, I can't remember who it was who said it now, but we were talking about administrative devolution. And of course, there was a very great deal of administrative devolution in the 20th century, in particular to Scotland and Wales, Northern Ireland. But it wasn't politicized in the way that it has subsequently become. And it's the wisdom of the British state was encapsulating what Jack Straw said when he was asked about the Lothian question. He said, "My advice is don't ask it." And and that actually was the attitude of generations of politicians charged with managing these relationships. Let's just do things under the counter and make the whatever adjustments we need to, and don't rock the boat. But of course, in this much more with formal devolution, then all these relationships have become politicized in ways which raise these questions of identity in much sharper focus and lead to a politics of resentment and a politics of fairness and so on. The other thing I'd say about, empire is interesting because everyone sees it as one of the great projects of the British state, which kept the British state together, and there was some discussion of that in relation to the number of Scots who were important empire builders. But it's worth thinking also in that connection of the United Kingdom as an empire, and the Union as an empire, to think of the other institutions which also have been very important in binding the Union together. And they include things like the Royal, I'm talking in the past tense a lot of the time, things like the Royal Mail, things like, immensely important cultural symbols like pillar boxes and telephone boxes, but also the services which underpin them, and the idea that a letter would be delivered anywhere in the country for the same price and so on. And of course the NHS was also another critical institution in binding the Union together, and devolution hasn't quite unwound all of that, but it has begun to unwind a lot of it. But the reasons for the Union staying together, a lot of the reasons have, if not disappeared, they've certainly weakened recently. And I think it was very noticeable in the referendum campaign how difficult it was for the Unionist side actually to present a positive case for the Union, as opposed to the bad things that were going to happen if the Union ceased to exist. And I think that's a whereas 100 years ago there were very, very strong arguments that politicians of all varieties had to support the Union, and it's one of the things which makes this a distinctive moment, I think, is that all the Unionist parties are in a bad way as Unionist parties. I mean, the Conservatives are in a good way in another sense at the present time, but as Unionist parties, none of the old Unionist parties have anything like their former strength or their former appeal as Unionist parties, and all are having to find a different identity and different strategies. David mentioned Jim Murphy talking yesterday, and Jim Murphy said one of the things he said in his talk was that if Labour is to recover, its recovery will have to start in Scotland, which seems counterintuitive, but that's a Unionist argument, and it's the argument that also that the only way to stop the Conservatives playing the SNP card in the future is if Labour regains its strength and support in Scotland. Jim Murphy was then honest enough to admit that this put the bar to Labour recovery very high indeed. And I think that, but I think that actually, I think that makes the point. At one time, Labour just assumed it was a Unionist party, and actually its rallying of all the different parts of it, its strength in Wales and Scotland, was so much part of Labour's identity. And suddenly, certainly as far as Scotland is concerned, that's no more. And then finally, finally, the final theme, global Englishness. I thought we had some really a lot of interesting things were said about this. Christian's question was, has Englishness become global? And there was a lot of talk about London. London kept popping up in various ways, and I think the significance of London and the difficulty of actually binding London into other sorts of political narratives about England has become much more marked in recent time. and that's partly because of all things we know about the cosmopolitanism of London, about the maldistribution of resources towards London, but also the still the very strong sense of locality and place which defines Englishness in many other parts of the UK. So that on the radio the other day they were talking about the Northern Powerhouse and the fact that parts of Yorkshire are proving difficult to corral into this great new enterprise that London has launched, and in particular, North Yorkshire doesn't see why it should have to join with Leeds, and they had a reporter in Northallerton, and he found someone to interview, and he said to her, do you think it would be a good idea if Northallerton should join with Leeds? And you could hear her almost sort of spluttering. And she said, and in the end she said, politely, she said, I shouldn't think so. And of course that of course is a very and the thing, part of a thing which has always prevented bottoms-up regional devolution in the past in England is because of the intense rivalries within the region. But I do think it, when you take that into account and you take into account immigration, which we talk quite a lot about, and the profound effect which immigration is having, and the different impact that is, or the different perceptions of that as far as London is concerned and as far as the rest of the country is concerned. That again is something which is very becoming very defining for our politics. And I thought the latest YouGov poll on Labour Party members is absolutely striking in terms of the attitudes of Labour Party members on a whole range of issues, including immigration, but also the EU and lots of other things, including bombing of Syria and so forth. And then the views of Labour voters and the views then of all voters. And the mismatch is very great. And it's this... I think Mike talked about the image of England as a shrinking island and England as a world island. And in a way that these very different identities and the competition over them, this which is again, it's of course a contest of, it's an imaginative contest as well as a practical political context, but that the outcome of some of those questions are going to determine how significant a moment this is for England and for Englishness. Thank you.